Hi and welcome. This is Leaving Babylon, and I'm Madeline. Today I'm going to be presenting part 3, called The Wall, of my Surrounding of the Camp series, or Surrounding the Camp. And this has to do with surrounding of the camp as described in the book of Revelation, chapter 20. So if you go to verses 7 to 9, you will see that there are nations that are called Gog Magog, and they are basically going to surround the camp of the saints and the beloved city at the very end of Satan's little season. I believe we're in Satan's little season now, and so the future and the end of this time is building toward that surrounding the camp as described. So one thing I want to talk about today is obviously the wall. And this is going to actually cover a number of different walls throughout history. This is going to talk about, I'm going to sort of cover the purpose of walls and kind of that ancient context, but also what does that mean to us today? I think this is a really important part of the overall picture that we're building of this kind of Gog Magog story that's embedded within the very end. So that's surrounding the camp time frame after the little season. And it's my view that we cannot talk about walls throughout the history of mankind, and that would be biblically speaking, as well as more recent history. And I would say that we have to kind of balance this off. Why are walls needed, and what were they, what was the purpose of them? Why were they such a big factor? And so I would like to talk about, initially, I think the important part to note is that in the Old Testament, the reason cities, I think, had such big walls is that they had really big creatures around. They were called giants. And the land of Canaan, which actually was the promised land that God had promised to his people as they came out of Israel, at the end of Exodus in the Bible, and then we go into Numbers, and he's leading them into the land of promise. And so these people who have been following him through the wilderness, trusting in him, learning to rely on the Lord, and learning to become a nation, a distinct nation. And I think that was the purpose of the wilderness, was to separate them from the idolatry of Egypt. They went through their own internal struggles with that as they traveled through the wilderness. Interestingly, the wilderness was called Zin, and some versions call it Sin. I think it has to do with that area in Asia that I talked about in the first part of this series. And so I'm not going to focus too much on geography right away, but I do want to just point out that they're coming out of this wilderness of Zin or Sin. And I find it also interesting that as we come to Christ and as we come into covenant with the Lord Jesus, that we also come out of a wilderness of sin. I think that's the beautiful way that God actually describes our journey from death and destruction and from the idolatry into new life and into the new promised land with Jesus. And so I just think that's a really nice touch that God obviously intended to be there. So this is from Numbers 13, verses 21 to 23 and 27 to 29. I'm just going to read through it. There are some difficult names, as there always is in Numbers, so apologies in advance. I just want to point out the fact that these brave individuals who went to spy out the land of Canaan, I believe they knew that they were going into a land filled with giants. And it is a beautiful thing to know that God was leading them there, and he would give them the faith to trust in him, and so that they could cleanse the land of these people that were had corrupted God's creation. So verse 21. So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob, near the entrance of Hamath. And they went up through the south and came to Hebron, Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai. The descendants of Anak were there. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes. They carried it between two of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs. Then they told him and said, "We went to the land where you sent us. It truly flows with milk and honey, and this is the fruit. Nevertheless, the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. Moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the banks of the Jordan." And what I'm drawing attention to here is a few things, actually. First of all, the names of the people groups all end in ites. So we have Amalekites, we have Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites. And I've kind of picked up that these other nations were identified as basically different kinds of giant races. And we'll see a little bit more about that. But I would just like to say that also indicative, they brought proof back to the people of how big everything was in this land of Canaan. Even the grapes were massive. They had to carry them in between them. So the fact that God had told them this land flows with milk and honey, it wasn't hyperbolic, it was real. This was a land that was overflowing with abundance. And I think that God chose a very beautiful, very abundant place for them. And to my point about the modern state that is called or named Israel, I think we just have to reconsider why we think that to be true, considering what we learn here. And so, I think throughout the scriptures we read about different interactions with these giants. Probably the most well-known story is the one of Goliath and David, and that would be the one on the left there. And, that's probably a fair representation of the difference in size, I think, between Goliath and David. I have seen others where, and I have a few in this demonstration here that show Goliath as super huge, but I think this would probably be the most accurate depiction of Goliath. And David actually might have been a little bit older than that. But anyway, I think the fact that it depicts giants, and I kind of like the background as well because it's actually a mountainous region, which I think is accurate. So, these people describe themselves, and I'm talking about Joshua and Caleb from the Israelite nation. They describe themselves as grasshoppers in the sight of the people that lived in Canaan. And, you might think, well, they're just over-exaggerating. They might not have been. They might have been absolutely tiny. We don't get a lot of measurements from the Bible as to how big these people were, but we do have some. And one of the other things I had started to think about as I was, researching the nations of Gog and Magog, or Gog Magog, is that there was a number of different types of races of mankind, and maybe not mankind, but other kinds of groups of, let's just call them people for now, people groups. And some of them were named in that passage. So you had the Amorites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amalekites. And, these people groups were recognized as the enemies of the true God. They were recognized as the enemies of Israel. And I think the Lord of the Rings gives a lot away when they describe, so they've portray all of these different groups living on this same terrain. And so, you have got your elves and your dwarves and your people, your hobbits, dragons, orcs, and ents, your balrogs and your trolls. Those are just a few, and I've pictured some here. So I've kind of put little labels on these just to kind of show what I'm thinking. And I think the ancient giant races are represented there on the top right. I think Gog and Magog nations are represented on the left. I think they were They were warring nations, so they would make war with one another. I think they were brutal. I think they were violent. I think they were practicing so much of those kinds of idolatrous activities. So, infanticide and bestiality and all kinds of things. And then I think to the right, so at the bottom right, I have the wizard, who I believe is the holder of secrets, this kind of hidden occult. These people that kind of, they hold all the secrets, they kind of coordinate, and they have a way of kind of influencing, but not directly leading. They kind of lead from behind, like in kind of a subversive way, shall we say. And there's always the dualistic part of that as well. So referring to Lord of the Rings, you always have your white wizard and your black wizard, and they're kind of manipulating things from behind and using magic where needed and those kinds of things. So I think those represent the secret societies that have, I kind of think of it actually as the shadow. It's like this kind of snake in the grass. It's indiscernible, but it's there. There's something influencing the storyline. And I think they kind of slither around, and, the overall, or the big serpent, the dragon, is the one who actually tries to mimic what God is doing and then take credit for it and those kinds of things. But obviously they use magic and powers that they shouldn't. So just going back to some of the giants named in the Bible. So we have Goliath. So that one's a lot bigger depiction on the right. And then we have the king Og of Bashan, who is named in scripture as well. So, they found his bed, and I think it was like 13 feet. I'll just read something in a minute. But, I think there was a point in time where average people like us also were mingled on the earth with very large individuals, which would have been called giants. And the reason I'm talking about this is because I think there was a major reason to have walls. Okay, so if you were a very large race and you kind of inhabited a certain part of the land, and then your enemy was on the other side of like a river or something, and they would also have big walls, you'd need fortresses to keep yourselves safe and be able to, withstand attack. So who is the king Og, the king of Bashan? So where was the kingdom of Bashan? It was so this kingdom, along with the Amorite kingdom, acted as gateways into the promised land. To enter into their rest, Israel had to defeat these two kingdoms and their kings. And it was Sihon and Og. And they kind of talk a lot about the geography, which I'm tempted to go into, but I won't. So after spending 40 years wandering in the wilderness, in the book of Numbers, it talks about Israel began to reapproach the promised land, and on their way, they met and defeated Og and Sihon. And I'm just scrolling down to the parts I've highlighted. So the Bible tells us some interesting details about Og and the giants of Canaan. Og slept on an iron bed that was 13.5 feet tall and 6 feet wide. Apparently Moses or others saw it after they slew Og. So in Deuteronomy 3, it talks about that. He was a giant of a man. Apparently, that was not unusual. The promised land was full of powerful kingdoms, people, and even giants. The land which we have gone, so this is in Numbers, the land which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak who come from the Nephilim, and we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seem to them. The story of Genesis 6:4 of the Nephilim apparently held deep sway on the hearts of the Israelites. These three descendants of the Nephilim were of great height, and the scouts felt like grasshoppers in their presence. Og, king of Bashan, was also a giant of great height, but just who were these ancient giants? And how can at least some of them be from the Nephilim? So according to Moses, these giants were generally called Rephaim. Each people in Canaan apparently had their own name for these giants. Moses records that the Moabites called the Rephaim Emim. The Ammonites called the Rephaim Zamzumim. Imagine trying to say that every day. Moses also identifies Og, the king of Bashan, as a remnant of the Rephaim. The land of Bashan was so associated with Rephaim that it was called the land of Rephaim. Lastly, Moses also confirms that the sons of Anak, the Anakim, were Rephaim. So we're getting an idea here that these people groups were actually identified by their, I would say their physical characteristics as kind of these creatures, right? I hesitate to say they were people. And I don't know how necessarily they became to be, but we do know that the Bible says that giants were before the flood and again after. So the flood certainly cleansed the land of a certain iniquity. However, after the flood, there were giants as well. And so we see that as we get into these books. And so I wanted to just read a little bit through Deuteronomy because I won't read too much, but this is actually important to see that the size, right? So all the cities of the plain and all Gilead and Bashan unto Salchan and Andre, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. And so this is the kind of the battles that they were going through, and they took this land. And then it says here, for only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rebath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. So this is just some background into that. And then just going back to the wall theme, I just want to highlight in Ezekiel 38. This is a prophecy to Gog, the chief prince or the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. And it says here, you will ascend coming like a storm. So ascend, I just want to draw a line around that word. Covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops and many people with you. Verse 10, thus says the Lord, on that day it shall come to pass that thoughts will arise in your mind, and you will make an evil plan. You will say, I will go up against a land of unwalled villages. I will go to a peaceful people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. And I think I just wanted to highlight the unwalled villages part, because I think that actually influences the storyline of the end of the little season. Okay, so thinking about that kind of giant theme, and let's, picture the land of Canaan, which was the land flowing with milk and honey. This was the promised land. This was the place where God had led the Israelites out of the wilderness, and then across the Jordan, and then into the land of giants. I want to show you some of the evidence, I believe, tells us that the north region is that land. And whether there was influence on the land, the shape of the land because of cataclysm, which I do believe is true, I also want to show you that there's remnant evidence that the land at the north shows us that there is a very ancient history, and I believe that it is related to the giants. So Alaska has a national reserve called the Bering Land Bridge National Reserve, and it has just these massive stone structures. And I've showed this in other videos before, but I'm just going to show these again. And I want to show you on the map there. So we're talking the region at the very far north of North America. And we have these structures. Now these actually look like remnants of old walls, like ancient walls, okay? And they're all over this area. There's people that actually go up here, and I do have a little bit of footage I want to show you. But you can see more of it here. So you can see along the hills over there and all across the hilltops and around this region, it's as if there was, like an old civilization there. And I'm going to show you some more here. So this is on it's called nationalparksunits.com. And there's a little video here, which I thought I would just show you a bit of. So I'll press play. I'm going to move my face out of the screen. And so it just shows you from the perspective of somebody who's there, this area that to me, it actually looks scorched. Even at the ground, right in the foreground, it almost looks like there's been some kind of cataclysm. And Alaska is somewhere you would always think is full of trees and mountains and, like very lush forest. But that is not this area. This area is covered in nothing but these very large stones. And I just think it's fascinating to see this demonstrated here. And I would find it hard to deny that there is an old civilization there. You can see the height of them. There's, people standing here. So, it might be interesting to go and visit that for some people, but I wonder at what catastrophe actually wiped out this ancient civilization is what I would call it. The other thing is I have done a lot of reading of northern material, as old as I can find, and there is material that talks about finding giant bones up in the north there and remnants of ancient civilization. So it is a thing, and I don't want to discount that. Now this one here is, I think it's called Manpupuner, and it's the rock formations at the north of Russia. So these are the Ural Mountains, and I've just circled some people down at the bottom there so you can see how massive these are. Again, this is not that. So this is all around the north. Let's just say Russia, Alaska, and these monuments to me look like very old walls, or like kind of like if you had a supporting like the central supports of your walls, like the strongest areas that just can't be knocked down because they're holding everything else up. That's what this looks like to me. And like I say, they're massive. So the Manpupuner rock formations, it's called, so in English it's Small Idol Mountain, and there's 7 stone pillars. And again, I mean, they might not be idols. I think they look more like remnants of walls. But they're called the 7 Strong Men rock formations. And then here it says Poles of the Komi Republic. And they talk about millions of years and all of this. But no, I actually think these are biblical. And, part of my theory is that the original lands of the Bible were at the north. And everything that I read in the Bible tells me that giants, where you find remnants of giants is where the giants were. And where the giants were, the Bible tells us. So I like to keep things simple. And so the other thing I want to talk about, so there's a number of walls that we could we could talk about. I won't necessarily talk about all of them. One of them is the walls of Jericho, which were knocked down by the Lord and by, his interaction with his people. So he told his people to march for 7 days around the walls and then to shout and blow their trumpets. And then the walls actually collapsed, which I find such an intriguing story. So I don't really use AI. I just have to put that out there as a as a warning. Like, I don't use AI myself, but I thought this was an interesting little video here, so I'm just gonna turn it on really quickly. Yeah, I just found that fascinating. And then there's this one here.
About sound and healing. While the Bible doesn't mention specific frequencies, it emphasizes the power of music, sound, and vibrations in spiritual and emotional healing. And we see a clear example in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 23. We read how David's music brought relief to Saul, calming his troubled spirit. In Acts chapter 16, verse 25 and 26, Paul and Silas sang hymns in prison, and their songs led to miraculous deliverance. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 20, vibrations created by the shouts of the Israelites and the blowing of trumpets caused the walls of Jericho to collapse.
So I'll just stop that one there. But yeah, I think the what I like to really focus on is the enormity of the challenge that was in front of the people of God, and how he taught them through these challenges and how to overcome them by relying on him and working with him and obeying him. So these are kind of the more biblical principles that I see in the stories, and I think that just gets demonstrated when we start talking about giants and the enormity of challenge that lay ahead of the people of Israel. When we're talking about walls, I don't want to ignore the Great Wall of China. This is something that's come to my attention more in the last little while as I've been studying the Gog Magog connection to the Camp of the Saints and to the Beloved City and to the Millennial Reign. And this is something that I posted on YouTube recently on my community posts. If you haven't been there, I encourage you to go look at what's there. I do share quite a lot of information there, and then sometimes I might reference it in my videos as well. So a friend of mine, Terry, who also has a channel, it's 5022 Freedom, he shared a video on his channel, and you can go find it. I'll put a link in the description. He was kind of recording a TV program. I think it was the late night Stephen Colbert speaking to Donald Trump, actually. So we had Trump on the show. And this is kind of part of the conversation, so I'll just relay it to you now, and then I'll move into this talking about the Great Wall of China. And so basically he said they were talking about the Great Wall of China because it came out of them talking about the wall that Trump was building, and so this kind of comment came up about the Great Wall of China. Stephen Colbert said, Jesus Christ built that wall, or Jesus built that wall. And right away, Trump says, yes, he did. He did. That's true. Something along those lines. So twice he confirmed right away that, yes, Jesus built the wall. And so that's very interesting. And I just wanted to highlight that for those who aren't aware, because I do think that they actually reveal these things on TV for us as kind of a hidden it's like entertainment, but they're hiding the truth within their entertainment. So it's their method, and most of us are aware of that by now. So my question is, was the Great Wall of China a highway for pilgrims to travel to the Celestial City from all over Europe and Asia? And this came out of a conversation with another friend of mine, and it was kind of this thing. It was like, hey, was this actually like a road? And And then I thought, oh, wait, like, was this a highway? Like a high, like highway? So I put that out on my channel, and I want to read to you something from the Noah Webster's dictionary from 1818. And it references something called the Celestial Empire, a name often used in Europe and America as a popular designation of China. It is derived, according to Williams, from the Chinese word Tian Chan, that is, heavenly dynasty, meaning the kingdom ruled over by the dynasty appointed by heaven. So we're not going back that far. This is 1818, and it sounds like at that time they were aware that this empire in the East was actually called the Celestial Empire. So I'm putting this out there because I think I cannot ignore the fact that I think this actually connects to what we're talking about. So in Isaiah 49, I had some people commenting under that post on YouTube. So I will share the verses that were shared with me. So Isaiah 49, 11 and 12, and I will make all my mountains a highway, and my highways shall be exalted. Behold, these shall come from far, and lo, these from the north and from the west, and these from the land of Sinim. So that's those verses. And then Isaiah 35, 8 says, and an highway shall be there, and a way, and it shall be called the way of holiness. The unclean shall not pass over it, but it shall be for those, the wayfaring men, though fools shall not err therein. And, I think it's very interesting to me that this wall goes over mountains. I've been looking at it online, and a lot of it is kind of crumbled down now. But the wall goes over many mountain ranges in China, and it kind of ends close to the sea, which, if you think about that, could be a location where they then sailed to the holy city. That's just sort of some of my speculation, but obviously that's an avenue that I'm exploring, and I'm trying to work out what the details, especially on a biblical basis, what that would look like. So I think it's very possible that this is actually a highway. And why would it be built up so high? Well, it was like a safe, like a safe haven, somewhere that you could travel safely. And I don't see why it couldn't be a highway as described in Scripture. Then the other thing I want to show you is that even in television, they show us kind of these, like I say, these hidden messages. And there was this commercial done by a company called Geico, and it clearly shows what I think is, really giving us an insight into China and the wall.
What should we do? Geico. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.
So that kind of just shows me that there's a known connection between giants and China and the Great Wall of China and so on. So these are connections that we're just forming here. There was also a movie done, and I've had to film it like this because I didn't want to get a copyright strike on my video. So I've kind of filmed it as it's just previewing in the screen. But this is called The Great Wall, and it has Matt Damon and a few other, Willem Dafoe, I think, is in it, a few other actors. But this, literally is about kind of the Gog Magog storyline, and it talks, it's kind of depicting the wall as a battlement, like they're opposing this oncoming attack by these creatures, which they're identifying. I think this is kind of what they're doing, is identifying as Gog Magog. So I'll play this. And I haven't allowed any sound either because I didn't want any strikes on this. But you can see how they're standing over the wall. They're watching down this cavern kind of between these two mountains. And then you can see this horde of creatures. And I personally think they look more like, what they've described as dinosaurs, or what, we've come to know as like dinosaurs. But I don't think that Gog Magog were dinosaurs. I think they were more like human-like creatures. And so this is a little bit of an artistic expansion on that. But you can see here how they've clearly shown China and the Great Wall of China, and these creatures just pouring. And like, the book of Ezekiel talks like, sort of describes Gog Magog at the end covering the land like a cloud. And so I think that's what the imagery is here, is it's very much like a cloud. So that's just something that I've picked up in media. And I wanted to show you this again. This is one of the images I had from my first video. And I'll just move my picture again here. So something that I think just, I just want to talk through a little bit here is Gog Magog were described in ancient texts, and we've read through a couple of those, as being a kind of race that were giant, but they were also cannibalistic. So they would feed on people. And there's also stories about people like Alexander the Great putting them, or sort of like holding them back behind some so-called gates or a wall. And I think that actually did happen. I'm not too sure personally about the Alexander the Great story, because I think that if anything, there would have been a movement of these people out of the land. Let's just say, like, pushed back out of the land, let's say behind walls. And while the biblical narrative tells us that they will come out of the four quarters of the earth, and they will cover the land like a cloud at the very end. To me, that's talking about the very end. But I think they always kind of lived in the north. Like, I think that's where they're from. So when it says they will come from the north, I think that's because they were giants, and they were these creatures that lived in these lands. And so I think that's where they're from. But as for where they are now, and where they will be at the end of time, the end of the little season, I think they are being contained. You see, so if you go back all through history, you see the giants and these creatures living in all of these northern regions. But we don't have a lot of documentation from the millennial reign. So what I'm going to try and show you is that I think, even just from these pictures, I think that these creatures were actually contained. I think they were pushed away. I think there are walls somewhere keeping them contained. Now, we talked about Prester John, and we've also talked a little bit about Alexander the Great. And what I would like to propose, and I did find this document here that kind of expresses what I was thinking, is that this person, and this is a Chinese person, I think, wrote this article to say, Alexander the Great, Prester John, Strabo of Amasia and Wonders of the East. So this person analyzes the wonders referred to the realm of Prester John and the imagination of India as exemplified in the pseudo-letter of Alexander the Great. So the pseudo-letters, I don't think they're pseudo-letters, I think they are real letters, attributed to Prester John and Alexander, demonstrate imagination and identity construction. And what I'm kind of proposing by showing this is that I think identities were created, but I think they were also used to conflate stories And kind of like this, actually, where they're saying, well, this is just a pseudo letter. I think somehow there was certain texts that actually made it and survived the millennial reign, transition into the little season. And I think it's possible that texts like this actually reveal some of the realities. And so they label them as pseudo, but I think they are real. And so that's just to deal with that. But so there's another person called Herodotus. And so the aim of Herodotus's account was to explore and analyze the relationship between Greeks and non-Greeks. Now, Greeks are a big piece of the puzzle because I think the Greek world was everywhere. Like, I think, I don't think it was contained to the islands in the Mediterranean. And if you were to go back and look at my Sides of the North series, I show a lot of evidence to give my view that the Pacific Islands were actually Greece. And many of them are not there now. And I think the islands were removed in the cataclysm. And I think that I think is where Greece was. And one of the reasons for that, just to give you a little bit of insight, is that the entire north was cartographed by the Greeks. So therefore, I think it very unlikely that a tiny little group of islands in the Mediterranean spawned these people that would then go out into the Atlantic, where they actually didn't think there was anything past there, go up to the entire north, like go way to the north, and do their cartography all around the north. I think it's much more likely they were the northerners. And so yeah, they just go through a little bit like this, where they're talking about fictionalizing and pseudo-documents and things like that. And it talks about making up sources. But why do they demote these writings? I just put a little note here. Why do they demote these writings? It's because these writings do not serve the common narrative. In fact, if people took these accounts seriously, they would not believe the common narrative or the modern narrative at all. And I think because they can't hide these, they do an awful lot of work to demote them and to discredit them. And that's these highlighted in red. They talk about fictionalizing experiences and accounts of travels and things like that. So here, Friar William of Rubric, who traveled to Constantinople and to the court of the great Khan of Mongol from 1253 to 1255, and then the world of the East could be referred to as India. So there was a time when the entire East was actually referred to as India. Like that whole eastern region of Asia was actually known as India. Cathay and the unknown land that stretched across the realm of the Turks, all of that is in the far north of Asia, modern-day Russia. Okay, so they talk about pseudo-documentation. I don't think these were pseudo, I think they existed. So some writers chose to believe that they should turn to the east to recover the lost hierarchy, and thus the Eastern Paradise became a prominent perspective. So the people were actually catching on to the fact that, hey, wait a second, it sounds like the East is actually somewhere that's been covered up or, discredited, and maybe we should start thinking about this. So they're saying that writers actually were turning to the East and that they believed in this Eastern Paradise. So in the Middle Ages, India was perceived as a place where Christian teachings by St. Thomas took hold, and that further east, an Assyrian patriarch stayed in the kingdom of Oponia, meaning Japan. So I just want to put that out there. And then I also think that Prester John and Alexander could have been the same person, something like that. I find this really difficult to believe, so I want to deal with this right now. But the Alexander story includes the Gog Magog story. So a lot of conflation, again, between Gog Magog and Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great was like 200 something BC, maybe 300 BC. So way before Jesus, okay? And I don't know why they bring that story in. I think it's to circumvent the very end time Gog Magog. I think that's kind of what they're doing here with the Alexander story. I think that if they can say that it happened closer to the time of Ezekiel, then Revelation is just kind of, a far off distant, maybe like a poetic reference or something like that. So I'm not too sure why the Alexander story is there. But what I do think is interesting is this. So, this article actually goes a little bit into walls. And it looks like, well, something that some people have mentioned is that Alexander the Great closed Gog Magog in these mountainous areas in the Caucasus regions. And I don't totally think that's true. But this article actually goes into talking about Trump, really weirdly. So I want to just read a little bit of this. So it's talking about refugees, and it's talking about how they come to these places for refuge. And then it says here, as I've written about before, the concept of the sanctuary city is an ancient one within the archaic and classical Greek world. The concept of this word here, asulia, developed in relation to spaces in and around temples. And so then it talks about, despite the fact that these individuals are unarmed, so it's talking about refugees, President Trump has sent 5,800 troops to the border in order to stave off any attempt to enter the country by persons he has dubbed invaders. And I find this correlation between Trump, the border, the wall, and these unwelcome people trying to, there's this like story building that there's all these thousands of people trying to come in. And I'm not discrediting it completely, but I'm just saying, I find it interesting that these narratives are built. And the reason I say that is because I found a video of Trump, and I think it was a Pizza Hut commercial here, where he actually talks about, he relates himself and Napoleon to being of the same, cut from the same cloth. So I'll just play this really quickly.
Napoleon, Alexander the Great, Donald Trump. We're all cut from the same cloth, and that cloth is very, very large. It's not too big.
So that's just a little clip, but you can see why this theme of the wall and a theme of an invading host and the Alexander story, and he's starting to connect himself to that theme. And then we have the biblical theme of Gog Magog and, these sorts of things. So I just want to, I'll come back to Trump later on. But again, I'm just going to tackle this misnomer, I think, is that the Alexander story allegedly happened in the Black Sea, Caspian Sea area. And for some reason, they say that he held back the hordes of Gog and Magog between these two seas here in this mountain range, which honestly I just find kind of ridiculous. And these areas aren't even where the old maps or even the old descriptions tell us that they were. So I don't think this is true. The other thing is there's Alexander with two horns, and I just think that that also indicates that he is possibly a fabricated character, or at least maybe he's given credit for doing things that didn't actually happen. And one of the maps here actually shows, a little bit more, I would say, of getting towards more of an accurate perspective. So it says here, the following map of the world in 400 AD shows the tribes of Yajuj and Majuj, or Gog and Magog, during that period, which includes the Rouran Khaganate in North China. So really, we want to be getting up to the right and to the north there, where it actually says Siberian peoples, way up there. That would be where these people lived. But at least they're more in China there. I would still say that's not accurate. But the other thing is that they called, and this came out of a comment on my last video, someone says, what about the three, the three gorges in China? Because I also posted something on my community posts that someone had sent me pictures of a portal in the sky opening and the sun coming through a portal. So it's a very interesting and insightful comment. The gorge, so they call that area the gorge, between, the two seas there, which they allege Alexander actually stopped the hordes at. So I'm just going to show you how what I think is ridiculous in the common narrative of Gog Magog and the Alexander walls. And you get pictures like this, which show the giants on that side, and then this kind of a wall across between these two seas. And then you also see the Great Alexander Wall further down, which there is a wall in Iran called the Gorgon Wall, and it's a bit like Hadrian's Wall, where it's not actually very high, like you could just step over it as a regular person. There might be some taller parts to the Gorgon Wall, but I think that's what they're alluding to here. There's no evidence for these gates in this mountainous region there, and yet it remains, I would say, the most prominent theory of what the wall, or what the Gog Magog is, or we're sort of constrained by. And it gets really silly because people don't actually know even the storyline, and it talks about the Great Wall of Alexander is a large and long fortification structure that were built. The Great Wall of Alexander is a large and long fortification structure that were built across the Caucasus Mountains by Alexander the Great as a protection against the Gog and Magog, giants that have long lived roaming the Great Caspian Steppe, and have been fighting with the Persians, Urartu, and the Colchis. And then it just keeps talking about it here. But I don't want to waste your time with that. I'm just showing you it is kind of ridiculous. So one thing I don't know if anybody is aware of, but I was not aware of this. There is also a story about Alexander the Great actually going to the gates of paradise. So it says here, the British Library's major exhibition, Alexander the Great, The Making of a Myth, so they're kind of saying he's a myth, showcases how stories about this ancient ruler were transformed and spread across centuries, cultures, and languages. Some of these legends take Alexander to the unknown realms of the world to face fantastic beasts, amazing people, and terrifying monsters. But one story takes him even further, to the gates of paradise. Now, this is another reason why I think this person is being conflated with other people, maybe another person during the millennial reign, or at the end of the millennial reign. And I think it's because, and it might even be John Prester, honestly, because Alexander the Great lived like 300 years before Jesus. And I don't think that there was any, this just sounds more millennial reignish to me, or at least after. And even the drawings of it, right? So apparently he went and knocked on the door of paradise. So in the written text, Voyage au Paradis Terrestre, interpolated in the Roman d'Alexandre. So this is Alexander's army at the gates of paradise. Well, isn't that interesting? Because to me, this just brings Trump to mind, going to the north. And Trump already identified himself with Alexander, So that's just interesting to me. But put together around AD 500 by the most eminent Jewish scholars at the time, the Babylonian Talmud, and so I don't recommend reading this, but I'm just telling you what it says, is the most important source of rabbinic code. In Judaism, it collects the replies and statements of prominent Jewish rabbis about various issues and questions. One of these records the following story. In the course of his adventures in the mythical East, Alexander reached the entrance of the Garden of Eden and raised a loud voice, calling out, "Open the gate for me." The sentry of the Garden of Eden said to him, "This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous shall enter into it. Since you are not righteous, you may not enter." He said to them, "If I will not be admitted, at least give me something from inside." They gave him one eyeball. He brought it, and he weighed all the gold and silver that he had against the eyeball. And yet the riches did not balance against the eyeball's greater weight. He said to his philosophers, "What is this? Why does this eyeball outweigh everything?" They said, "It is the eyeball of a mortal person of flesh and blood, which is not satisfied ever." He said to them, "From where do you know that this is the reason for the unbalanced scale?" The philosophers answered him, "Take a small amount of dirt and cover the eye." He did so, and it was immediately balanced by its proper counterweight. The eye is never satisfied while it can see. So this story exists, and I just find that alone a very fascinating point to make, because I did not know that the story of Alexander involved going to the gates of paradise. And just here again, so it says here in another article, medieval Christian stories have Alexander fighting female cannibals, six-headed giants, and other monsters in the best traditions of the giant slayer. In both Jewish and Christian tradition, Alexander is said to have fought his way to the gates of paradise in a story that suggests the futility of human endeavors, even those of one so great as Alexander. Again, so that I think is probably more of a medieval story, not 300 BC. So some other walls I want to talk to you about is the walls of Constantinople. And so these are a series of defensive stone walls that have surrounded and protected the city of Constantinople. Now, I don't believe that the city of Constantinople is in or was in modern day Turkey. Everything is displaced on the maps. But Constantinople, with numerous additions and modifications during their history, they were the last great fortification city of antiquity. And I'm just pointing out here that during the Byzantine Empire, I think there were still walled cities. And, there was also the Theodosian walls. And so I think I have that on a next. So I think there's just something else about the walls of Theodosian that is Byzantine specific, and this is also related to the sort of rulership during the time of the Byzantines. We've been hearing a lot about build the wall, over the last several years, and I think it's clear that there's some kind of intention to that. And, like a lot of what happens in politics and in the media, it's really more about programming the minds of people. And, I think I'm just being kind of tongue-in-cheek here with my slide, but I do want to just draw attention to the theme of the wall and how that came into the most recent election cycles in the USA. And we've all heard about the wall. This has become a huge theme. So not only do we have Trump likening himself to Alexander the Great, but we also have him building a kind of wall against these invaders, you see. And, it's referred to as the border wall. And it's often, brought up as like this big triumph of his presidency. And, one of the big outcomes of his presidency was to build this wall. And, I'm not going to completely discount that there might be some practical use to it. I'm sure there is some. But I think more importantly than that, it has actually embedded itself into the minds of people who have heard about this over and over and over again, this wall, right? So, something I did was I just went online and I just kind of scanned around. And so on this side where the camera is California, and on the other side is Mexico. That's just at the extreme west side of the wall. And it's like kind of a fence. And I mean, it doesn't actually look like it goes out that far. I could be wrong. But, given a kayak, you could probably just get around it. Maybe not, because there's these big towers up here. You probably wouldn't get very far. But on that note, the wall exists. It is there. Something that also accompanies the statements regarding the wall is an agency called ICE. And they are kind of the border enforcement people. And so it's very interesting to me that we have this border wall situation. And then we have them also being called ICE agents. Because when you know biblical cosmology and you know that the realm stops at the edges with ice around it, you know that is also that is actually the border. That is actually the border of the terrain that we know. That is the border of the realm that we are aware of, at least to our knowledge, right? And I think the Bible even talks about the edges where the water cannot recede any further. So it gives an impression that there is something stopping the water at the edges. And so the ICE border agents, or the Border Patrol, they're the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. They're responsible for identifying and eliminating border, economic, transportation, and infrastructure security vulnerabilities. There is an estimate of about 20,000 ICE employees in approximately 400 offices within the United States and 53 countries. That's right out of Wikipedia. So they aren't just in the United States. They're actually in 53 countries of the world. Now, I sort of, I work in projects, and often you'll give your project a name or like an acronym. And the acronym should actually be something that usually describes the project in kind of a very concise way. It might have a longer name, but it's actually something that reflects the actual project that you're doing. So the reason I question ICE is because Immigration and Customs Enforcement were selected letters for the acronym, okay? And often acronyms will give you a story or a picture of something that is, really connected to what you're doing. Let's just put it that way. So I find it interesting that the acronym ICE is being used as a border patrol agency. Like, that to me is very curious. And obviously here I'm alluding to the fact that does it actually mean there are patrols within this agency that are at the ICE border, the southern wall? And I think this actually is the starting point for a bigger picture of Gog Magog and that. So the other thing I just wanted to draw attention to was the logo. And I just want you to keep in mind that this eagle is not just an American feature. So this is an ancient, symbol. Some people would say it's a symbol of Rome. Other people might say it's a symbol of other countries from, let's say, Europe. And honestly, that head even looks more like a phoenix, I would say. So, U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and then here, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I remember Trump saying something about, identification, these sort of digital identifications were going to be on land and on sea. And, there is this land and sea on that shield there. So when we look at places like the southern border, let's just call it, it's actually Antarctica, whatever name we want to use for it. Some of the older maps give us even better ideas of what this land maybe looked like at one time, and how big it might be. So here you can see that it actually stretches and now this is more of a spherical representation of Earth, but let's just say it's flat and this land just spans, let's just say, all the way around the edges. Okay. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. I think we can. So it really touches at the bottom of South America. I would say it practically touches there. And I know that, I think it was in the 1980s, the Falklands War, that the British fought to basically retain their authority in that area south of Argentina, I think it was. So down here, the British have a lot of authority, and as do the Americans. So they work together. And just something anecdotally is that at the top there, you can see the land as well. So I think that is really, it's just such a fascinating map. And even if you look on the land on the Americas, you can see Chilaga there as well. And yeah, those rivers coming out of the north are visible there as well. So Greenland and some of these areas right at the top. And then over on the Tartarian side of North Asia, very close to the northern lands there. But today I am actually focusing on the south. So I've heard that in the Cataclysm, pieces of this southern land broke off and became Australia. And on some of the maps, actually, it says Australia. Oh, there you go. Australis or Australis. So Terra Australis Nondum Cognita. So it could be that this land at the very south was actually called Australia. And that's where that comes from. Now, when you look on older maps, there is a place on the older maps on the south coast, let's call it the south border, called New Swabia or New Schwabenland. And I've got the arrow pointing to it there. I found this a while back, and I honestly, this is, just take this with a pinch of salt, but I want to show you this anyway. Because some things like this, I do not doubt. So New Swabia, the great southern fatherland, is, this nation down here. And if you just keep going down, you get to some people who are connected to this land. And oh, who do we see? It says here, Melania Trump, though her family hails from Slovenia, she was born in and raised in New Swabia. Again, don't take this website's word for it. However, I'm going to keep going. This website here is called longnow.org, and there's a part of it called The Truth About Antarctica. So the only continent with no history of human habitation, the vast ice fields of Antarctica formed a blank slate onto which humanity can project itself. So can we see what's beyond the ice wall? Quick question, is there land beyond the ice wall? Record the ice wall. So these are just kind of statements, and then they show some of the land down there. And I think we're quite familiar with this area here as people recently who have been allowed to go to this area, you'll often see these mountains in behind where they are. So they're obviously going to a designated location. And they even show this kind of map there, which I showed before, but I'm just going to keep scrolling down here. So they make it look very cold and uninviting. But we do have this kind of treaty going on at Antarctica. And it's a treaty of all the worlds. This is a Hollow Earth declaration. I'm not going to go there. So basically, the connection here is that the Third Reich was involved with Antarctica. In 1939, the Third Reich sent an expedition to explore and claim parts of Antarctica. The Schwabenland was equipped with planes which dropped thousands and thousands of iron, those things, over the ice as they surveyed, none of which have ever been recovered. So they kind of start, opening up the narrative for this. So as we go into Wikipedia, what is New Swabia? So it was an area of the Antarctic explored with the intention to claim it by these people, the Third Reich, between 1938 and 1939. So I'm talking here about the ice wall at the south border. And the ice agents, I think, are an extension, maybe the unseen part of this framework, shall we say, of the Gog Magog storyline that is coming out in our modern times. Okay, so the region was named after the expedition's ship, Schwabenland itself named after the German region of Swabia. And, it just kind of lays out a little bit of the background of that. I won't go too much into it, but it was really around the beginning, I guess, or the middle of the World War II. And I'm just going to keep moving into some other documentation. The other thing that happened later on and I'll get back to the other part of this story, but the other thing that happened in the Antarctic was Operation High Jump. And so what they're saying here is that the United States got involved. So we see this convergence. This is what I'm trying to highlight here, is behind the ice wall. Let's just call it behind the ice wall. There's a convergence of the Third Reich, the United States, and Antarctica. And these space development programs, okay? So you have NASA, and you have all of these converging right now in this storyline, 1946 to 1947, Task Force 68. This was Operation High Jump. And even, the operation was organized by Admiral Richard E. Byrd. And I have to put a warning over this guy. He was one of them. Okay, so I know a lot of people really, really want to delve into this man's, exploration and his writings and his, even his interviews and things like that. I don't even listen to these people. They were part of the program. Okay, so I'm not saying I'm not listening to them, but what I'm saying is we have to be very critical about who we listen to. Sources actually matter. So, a lot of what they talk about here is about kind of like training, but they basically talk about, consolidating and extending the United States sovereignty over large practicable areas of the Arctic. So they make it as if they're setting it up to be some kind of scientific base. They're going to be based there and do things there. And this is kind of what they're talking about. So developing techniques for establishing, maintaining, and utilizing air bases on ice, with particular attention to later applicability of these techniques to operations in interior Greenland, where conditions are comparable to those in the Antarctic. So now we're drawing a correlation between the Antarctic and Greenland. Amplifying existing stores of knowledge of electromagnetic, geological, geographic, hydrographic, and meteorological propagation conditions in the area. Do you hear what I'm saying? This is a highly technical, highly political, highly secret. Even though they're telling us here what they're doing, they're not actually telling us what they're doing. They're just telling us these are the things that are involved down there. They're not telling us why they're doing this. Okay, so, and then on number 6 there, it says supplementary objectives of the Nanook expedition, a smaller equivalent conducted off eastern Greenland. But they don't tell us why. Like, they don't tell us why they're doing any of this. Like, they're doing all of these major operations in these regions, Antarctica, and with a view on Greenland. Do you hear me? So I'm going to just keep moving here. So Antarctica during World War II. International competition extended to the continent of Antarctica during World War II era, though the region saw no combat. During the prelude to war, Nazi Germany organized the 1938 Third German Antarctic Expedition to preempt Norway's claim to Queen Maud Land. And so, you actually get this collaboration going on. Well, I thought there was a war going on. Was the war a big distraction? Was the World War II just to get everyone looking left while they went right? The Falkland Islands are a big strategic location for a lot of what's going on down in Antarctica. And so the Third German Antarctic Expedition and New Swabia. So New Swabia was an area of land claimed by the Third Reich. It was explored in 1939. So if your country is at war and you're just trying to stop people from invading your borders and you're trying to take the Western, world, how are you also funneling your money over to Antarctica research? We have to ask these questions. And then United States Antarctic Service Expedition, 1939 to 1941. So it was the first government-funded Antarctic expedition since the United States exploring expedition in the 1800s. And it was led by Richard E. Byrd. That's what I'm saying, people. Like, you cannot just start buying the stories at face value of these people. Yes, listen to them, but be critical. That's my perspective, anyway. And they were commissioned by Roosevelt. So what was actually going on down there? These are the questions we have to ask. They were preparing for Operation High Jump. They were exploring Antarctica. They were working behind the ice wall, right? So there was a lot going on that they're not telling anybody about. So going back to, I just want to go back to this for a minute. Let's just compare, let's compare logos. I think they look fairly similar. They are too similar. But I just had to show you that because I think it's important to see. It is my view that when the Third Reich was at its highest point, there was knowledge of the north and of the south. And the Arctic is where the ark is. That's where, biblically speaking, the north is where Jesus is. It is where God is on his throne. And so, in my mind, the opposite of the Arctic is the Antarctic, literally. I mean, that's the spelling of it. It is the ante, so it is the opposite of the Arctic. It's just on the other end of the spectrum. And so in the way I'm piecing this together, and this is just my speculation, this is my building theory, is that America was designed to become the ushering in of the New World Order. I believe that wars are largely staged. I'm not saying people don't die in wars, and I'm not saying that good people don't go into service to fight in wars. I just think that the political theater creates scenarios that are to distract and to coerce the masses. What I really think goes on is a much bigger picture, and it is biblical. I think the biblical picture, if you can just overlay the biblical picture over all of this, it would be that the enemies of God had come to a position at the Third Reich where they were practicing the occult. They knew about the North. They had insider knowledge through fallen angel technology. They had insider knowledge through fallen angel entity contact. They were working with the occult. And these people had it in their grasp to collaborate with the rest of the world. So at the time where everyone else was seeing things through a war lens, if you just looked to the right, you would see that they were all working together going down to the Antarctic, and they were setting up down there. And I think that the wall and sort of, the shape of the earth, so their predecessors set this all up for them. So the education system tells us that we live on a spherical earth. It tells us we're flying through space. But the truth is we are on a plane. There's a lot of water, and there's edges to it, which is the ice wall. And I think they're taking advantage of the ice wall. And I think that when Ezekiel talks about Gog Magog coming out, Revelation talks about Gog and Magog coming out of the four corners of the earth, I think this very well could be what they're setting up from behind the ice wall. Because it's vast down there. Nobody's allowed down there. And we saw in a previous video in this series that people like Buzz Aldrin that had gone down there even reported very briefly before it was deleted that there is pure evil itself. And he even got sick and had to be hospitalized. And so there is something down there. There is a reason why people cannot go down there. There is a reason why they lead us to believe certain things about that area that are not necessarily true. So this treaty was written in 1959, 1st of December, in Washington, D.C., and they also moved all of the so-called, prisoners of war from the Third Reich into the CIA and into places like Disney and into places like NASA. So the traditional understanding of what happened during that time frame does not add up to the evidence that we see here. And the last thing I just want to talk about, which is the most important part, is the prize that we are inheritors of if we believe in Jesus Christ, if we are part of the family of God. We are inheritors of the kingdom. And that has to be taken with sobriety. It is our role here to speak the truth. And I just want to read to you about the New Jerusalem, because that is the future hope that we have. Our King, Our God reigns from there eternally. There is no changing that. Gog Magog and all of the scheming of the enemy does not change that our God is eternal. He is the King and he rules. And we are so honored to be his children. And I just want to read from Revelation and Esdras. And these are kind of what we are expecting to see in the end times. And I think that's probably not too far from now. Talking about the New Jerusalem, it had a great high wall with 12 gates and with 12 angels in charge of the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. There were 3 gates on each side, 3 on the east, 3 on the south, 3 on the north, and 3 on the west. Revelation 21, 12 to 13. And this is something that I think is really important to those of us who know and believe and have faith in the city that is built by God. And it is this in Esdras 6:27. Behold, the time shall come that these tokens which I have told thee shall come to pass, and the bride shall appear, and she coming forth shall be seen, that now is withdrawn from the earth. Esdras 6:27. And the picture here actually shows Jesus kind of peeking through the veil and speaking to one of the saints. I'm not sure which saint that is, but I do believe that there is a veil that will actually be withdrawn, and we will be able to see the holy city, the New Jerusalem, and we will be rewarded for our faith. You know, this is something that I was listening to JT and Jason Jack speak today. Today's the 9th of March, 2025. And they were speaking about kind of the New Jerusalem. And like Jason Jack was actually saying, like, wonder what shape it is. You know, it could be that the measurements actually make a pyramid shape, which kind of makes sense in my mind, why they would focus on that shape so much. And I think it is because that age-old Luciferian agenda was to take the throne of God and to seat himself on the throne and be God. And so I think that that is a possibility. But something else that JT said was, you know, we are the people that have faith. We're the ones that actually believe what the Bible says. And we are the seed of faith. So we are the seed of Abraham in that way, because Abraham believed in the city whose builder and maker was God. And we are that people too. So we are the true Israel. We are the seed of faith, the children of Abraham, the people that believe in the city of God. And as Ezra says, as a bride, you know, it will appear and the veil will be withdrawn. And so, you know, I just find so much hope in that, because in this time of deception, to have faith such as this is, it's a true miracle. You know, to believe in things we cannot see, that is the true miracle. And so I thank God for that. And I thank God for brothers and sisters who are on this journey of faith together, and realizing that, yeah, you know what? All of our evidence comes from Scripture. We can certainly go to the material world and show evidence of, you know, whether something's true or not. We can definitely do that. But the ultimate authority is the Scripture. It is the Word of God. And when we believe that, we cannot go wrong. Let God be true and every man a liar. So I really want to thank you for listening to this today. The theme really was the wall, and a number of walls through history, and just trying to give a perspective on what that might look like in the future. I think the Antarctic ice wall is actually a wall that is going to play into the final Gog Magog confrontation against the camp of the saints, against those of us who live on the earth in unwalled cities. I think they are going to come across the land like a cloud, and there's nothing to fear in that, because the Lord Jesus is our King and he waits for us, and eternal life is our reward for our faith in him. So I just want to encourage you, even though the times are getting very deep and there's a lot being revealed. I just want to encourage you to keep trusting in him, and don't lose faith. Don't lose heart. You're not alone. You know, there's Jesus, the angels, the saints, and those of us here in this realm that we live in. And so we are working together to find the answers through prayer and through the Holy Spirit. So trust in him. Take care. Thank you so much. Goodbye.